Okay, so this week's demo lab is going to focus on interactions. So you need this file and two other files that are attached on Blackboard. So the syntax file and then an Excel file. There is an Excel file in chapter 15, but this one, I removed a couple worksheets that we're not going to use, and then I added multivariate graphs for each of the interactions we'll look at that don't have the interaction so you can see and compare them as well. And then you need the same data set and codebook we've been using. So go ahead and open those. And the GSS data set does not have any interaction variables already in it. So we're going to have to start by making one. So we're going to start, again, we're going to use theism as our dependent variable. And we're going to start by doing an interaction of mental health and class. Okay, so in the syntax, I have that, well, so we can do this again, set print back on, just to make sure syntax shows up. Or again, that's edit options viewer. Make sure this is checked, okay? So there's two ways to make an interaction, syntax and dropdown, right? For the syntax, where it says compute, and it says interaction vname, that's the name that we want the interaction variable to be. So we're making one of, what did I say? Mental health and class. So why don't we call this interaction mental health class? It's kind of long, but that's okay. And then we're multiplying the two variables together. That's what this asterisk is for, and that's the formula. It's going to make a new variable that's this times that. So we need this period at the end. We need this asterisk in the middle. So the first parent variable is mental health. It doesn't matter the order. You could do mental health first and class second, or vice versa. My second one is class. Okay, so I'm just going to click on this line, click play, and I have made my variable. If I'm using dropdown, then I'm going to go to transform and compute. I'm going to say what I want it to be named. So like interaction mental health class, or interaction one, or mental class, whatever you want to call it. Why don't we call this interaction variable one? So I think below have v2 and v3. Let's see. Yeah, we'll just call it interaction one. Okay. So, and then here I'm going to put in my two variables. So it was class, and then I'm going to put this asterisk for multiply, and then the other one was poll views. No, sorry, it's mental health. Okay. So let's find mental health. Put it into there and click OK, and that'll generate it. So I just kind of double did this, right? So now I have two interaction variables. They're the same, just with different names, but I can use those either way. Okay. So we made our interaction variable. Now we're going to run a regression. And this time, it's just like before. So we're going to turn on weighting, and then we're going to turn off weighting so we can get it with or without the sample size. We have theism. We have, just like last week, our two variables, mental health and class. And then the only thing that's going to be different here is that we're going to also include our interaction of these two variables. So we're also going to include that interaction variable. Either one. I made it twice, but great, whichever one you made will work. And we're going to want to run it again without waiting. I'm just going to copy and paste that. Okay, so here's my syntax. Oops. So run this. Okay, so unweighted, this is my descriptors for unweighted. And then for weighted, I'm going to want descriptives and those last three, right? So same ones as last week. So here is my weighted one. Okay, So now we're going to complete a summary display table. So we could complete one and the spreadsheet that the book has linked to with like 4 different columns, one for each bivariate. So like we could do class and theism, mental health and theism, and then a multivariate or full model with both mental health and class, and then the interaction. Just to keep it simple, we're just going to do the interaction model here. But again, I'll show you that graph of the multivariate one without the interaction. So this is going to be the same as what we've done before in terms of what we put in. So right, our sample size from the unweighted one is 1210. Oops. And then if we go up to all of this, we can see here our R squared is 3.2%. Our overall model, the p-value is less than 0.001. And then here are our coefficients. So our intercept that constant one, that's 5.699. The p-value is less than 0.001. And here is its confidence interval. Okay, mental health. The coefficient value is negative 0.083. P is less than 0.001. And here's my confidence interval. And then I have class. My slope. P is less than 0.001. And my confidence interval. Now I have my interaction. So here's my slope for the interaction. P is 0.009. So that's not less than 0.001, but it is less than 0.01. So we're going to put 2 asterisks there. And then my confidence interval. Okay. So now I'm going to graph it. So mental health is days of poor mental health in the past 30 days, 0 to 30, and class is 4 categories: lower, working, middle, and upper. And so I can choose what kind of graph I want to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put class on the x-axis since it goes from 0 to 30, and then I'm going to use 4 lines and just show each of the different classes here. So first, let's look at, let's see, this one was mental health in class. So this is what it looks like without the interaction. So you can see, and what we know also from this output, right, with the interaction was significant, meaning that, right, it does, considering the interaction of mental health in class does improve our predictions over theism compared to not, right? And so we can look at our slope here and we can see how much of an impact we'll have in a minute, but right now, this one does not have the interaction. So you can see without the interaction, right, these lines are all parallel. And so basically, as your class increases, you're less theistic, and that holds constant across different days of poor mental health. And as you have more days of poor mental health, your theism decreases, and that holds constant across class. So that's the one without the interaction. And now that we've considered the interaction, let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put in these values. So 5.699. I have to be careful here. So this, I want the x-axis, whatever one I'm using on the x-axis, that's going to be this bottom one. And so, you know, if I only have one that's continuous or ratio like or ratio level, I have to use that. But regardless of the order here, I have to make sure I line these up correctly. So the x-axis one is actually going to be class. No, sorry, it's going to be mental health because that's the one going from 0 to 30 for the days. And the lines, I'm using class for lines, so that's going to go here. But again, if I wanted to whichever one I'm using for lines goes here. So it doesn't need to follow the order. It needs to follow which I'm choosing to put where on the graph. And then my interaction slope was 0.025. Okay. So these are my minimum and maximum for the x-axis. So the x-axis is mental health. I do have syntax in there if you wanted to like run and see the minimum maximum of mental health. You could look at the code book and see. So I know though, again, this goes from 0 days to 30 days of poor mental health, and we know at least one respondent is at both of those. So I'm just going to put that. And then for class, let me go to, I know there's at least one respondent in each class, but that could go from 1 to 4. So that's where the numbers go. Those are the values. And then above it, I'm going to put what this means. So 1 is lower class, working class, middle class, and upper class. Okay. And I also know that for this, I need to show my work. So now let's finish fixing this graph. Okay. So my x-axis again was mental health. So days of poor mental health in the past 30 days. And that's going to go from 0 to 30. And our y-axis is theism. Goes 1 to 6. Okay, so here is my graph. So lastly, tell the story of your interaction graph. So what do we see here? So this actually looks quite different than if we hadn't tested to include the interaction. Again, this was without the interaction. So you can compare. So before we just said as days of poor mental health increases, right, your theism is decreasing, but we actually see that it's not the same for all classes. So we can see that for folks with no days of poor mental health, right, that the lower class is the highest theism, and it kind of matches where these are, although maybe a little higher, but it matches the order. And then we can see that actually for the lower class, as mental health gets worse, we're seeing theism fall the most steeply. But for the upper class, we're actually seeing that while it starts right lower, as mental health gets worse, theism's actually increasing a little bit. And so we can see around, I don't know, 17 days of poor mental health or so, or 16 days, I don't know, that these are all kind of the same in terms of their theism, regardless of class, right? Because these slopes are different. And then we can see how it splits the other way. So we can see that there starts with this kind of gap, and then it narrows as mental health gets worse. And then once you get to folks who almost every other day their mental health is poor, they're looking about the same. And then you can see the gap starts to widen again in the opposite direction. So it's a different story here, right, than what we saw here, because we didn't account for the interaction here. Here it's just telling us, here's how mental health affects this regardless of class, and here's how class affects it, like as we hold mental health constant or as we control for it. But we didn't consider their interaction, and we can see that considering their interaction tells a different story of what's happening with these different groups. Let's look at the ones that we looked at last week. So last week with multivariate, so here you would just kind of describe again what you're seeing going on here. But yeah, so why don't let's go to this one, which was poll views and whether or not you own a gun. So I already made pull views and own gun. Well, we can start. That's fine. We can start with that one. So I made interaction 4 from that, and here is the regression with that. So let's just run that. Oh, I didn't make it. I mean, I put it in the syntax, but I didn't make it. Let me just run this whole. Why don't we just run these? I'm turning weighting on. I don't need my unweighted sample sizes for any of these. Okay, now, so we're gonna do this one. Full views and own gun. Okay, so I just need these for it. So here you can see that the original story in our multivariate was that as you get more conservative, you get more theistic, and whether or not you own a gun doesn't really make much of a difference at all. So now let's put these in, and we can see our interaction here is significant. So that means the interaction is improving our predictions. I mean, as long as B is not 0, you might see something on the graph, but that's as a sample statistic. But we're saying that we're confident that B is not 0. That's why P is less than 0.05 here. Okay, so for this, I don't have a choice about which to use, right? Because the own gun is an indicator variable. It's either 0 or 1. And so I'm choosing to do 2 lines, right? For not owning a gun or owning a gun. That's why I chose this one. And so my x-axis is going to be pull views. So for the x-axis, I'm putting the slope for pull views. And for the lines, I'm putting the slope for own gun indicator. Okay, and so the x-axis pull views goes from 1 to 7. And this is either going to be 0 or 1, with 0 being does not own a gun, and 1 being has a gun in home or garage. Okay, so this is theism. I'm not going to put in those labels right now, but let's see. And it goes 1 to 6. And this one is full views, which goes 1 to 7. Okay, so again, here we saw that gun ownership didn't really make a difference, and there's just this kind of increase as you get more conservative in theism. Here we can see it's still an increase, but it's a sharper increase among people who don't own a gun. So folks who don't own a gun start out as less theistic compared to people who own a gun. It's still within the 3 to 4 range, but this one's below 3.5. This one's above that. And then you can see that among folks who don't own a gun, right, their theism is, as they get more conservative, their theism is increasing until among almost just like a little bit more conservative than moderate, but you can see that they actually tie up. So then it doesn't really make a difference whether you own a gun or not. And then as you are more conservative, let me just confirm, yep. As you are in the more conservative areas, we can see that actually folks without a gun are predicted to be more theistic than folks with a gun. Okay, so you can see again that those with a gun are starting a little more theistic, and as they get more conservative, they're becoming more theistic, but at a lower kind of rate of increase compared to folks without a gun who start out a little bit lower. So starting out closer to believing in a higher power, but not a personal God, whereas these folks are much closer to sometimes believing. And then by the time you get to moderate, they're both at between sometimes believing in God and believing in God with doubts. And then we can see by the time you get to extremely conservative, you have those with a gun believing sometimes with doubts, and those without a gun believing without doubts as their predicted values. Okay, let's look at another one. So here's age and political views. This is one where you could choose which one you want to do on the x-axis and which you want to do for lines, right? Because you could do, here I did liberal, moderate, and conservative, although you could do extremely liberal and extremely conservative and do 2 lines again. You could do extremely liberal, moderate, extremely conservative. Or you could put 1 through 7 here for poll views, and you could do age like 20, 50, and 70 years old, or whatever you want to choose. So you can choose what you want to do. But we can see here that as folks get older, their theism is increasing, right? And that there's this gap where liberals, here, conservatives are the most theistic, followed by moderates, followed by conservatives. And again, this is just a regular multivariate full model. So these gaps are controlling for age, and this age slope is controlling for political views. So now let's go ahead and do, let's see, this was age and political views. So I'm going to run this, and let's put these in. So we have 2.531. I'm doing age for my x-axis. So I'm choosing 0.013, right? Oops. So I have to make sure, right, this isn't in order, but I have to line them up how I want it. And 0.01. Okay. And then you can see here my interaction is not significant. So you can see it's pretty small here. And we're not confident it's not actually zero. So that means that, right, the interaction of age and political views, we're not over 95% confident that among our target, among all US adults in 2022, it actually improves our predictions, that this actually matters. So this may look more similar to our last one, although again, this is our prediction lines, our regression lines are based on sample statistics. Okay, so we had 18 to 89 for age, and then if I'm doing poll views, let's just match it to the other one. So I did 2, 4, and 6 for liberal, moderate, and conservative. Okay, so what we see here is that we can still see, right, this gap. Well, you hold age constant, there's this kind of gap between liberal, moderate, and conservative. We can see that as age increases, theism increases. But it looks like this gap might widen a little bit as we get bigger. But again, that's based on the sample, and we're not confident that it actually would widen among all US adults. But in our sample, it looks like it's slightly widening, but not that much to really make a qualitative difference there. So we can compare these. We can see this gets up to 6 a little bit younger, right? Around like 75. Right, so it's a little bit different, but not much. Okay, and then last one. So if we wanted to do one that was just 2 indicators. So this is gender and owning a gun, right? And we can see that who's the least theistic. So men who don't own a gun, followed by men who do, then women who don't, all of them below 5, although men without a gun closer to 4. So men without a gun are closer to sometimes believing, but in between that and believing with doubts, these two are closer to the believing with doubts. And then this one is over believing with doubts, and between, closer to that, but between believing with doubts and believing without doubts. Okay, so that was the one without the interaction. So let's run our regression of this one. Here we go. Okay, so 4.252. So for this, it doesn't matter which you choose as IV1 or IV2. It's just that it's going to do which groups them, like what you group them by is going to be why that matters. I don't actually want that one there either. So IV1, the 0.569 was gender. Actually, we do want to just match it to this. Is that how we did it here? Yeah. Okay, and then IV2 was the gun. And we can see also that for the interaction here, negative 0.024, it's not significant, right? It could be 0 among all US adults. So we might see a little difference here because of this in the graph, but we're not confident that the interaction actually does make a difference here. Okay, and so we can see here, right, 4.25 compared to 4.26, 4.62, it's now 4.63, 4.82, still 4.82, and 5.17, it's 5.18. So adding the interaction barely did anything. It changed it by three of them by the predictions by 100th of a point. But they're pretty similar, and that interaction is not having much of a difference. So when we saw that it wasn't significant, when we graph it, we can see, right, that like we don't, considering this interaction isn't really going to tell us much. Whereas we could see with a couple of them, right, it's having a substantive change. So this one with full views and gun ownership, as well as this first one we did with class and days of poor mental health, where we're actually seeing something different. And then something like this, again, we weren't really seeing much difference, but again, if you ended up with something, let's say this was actually, I'm going to make up an, oops. We need to lower them a little. So, not great, but I'm just trying to show you that, right? Again, you could have it where they spread apart even more as they go, right? So you can have it where they don't have to, the ones that we saw that were really interesting, right, change directions. They don't have to. It could just be that, right, the gap widens substantively or it closes substantively, right? Like, see if that'll do it. Yeah, I mean, again, not, sorry, but here we can see that, you can see that, right, that these ones are very different and these ones are very similar by the time you get here. So lots of different interaction patterns that we can observe, some of which tell us really important things that without the interaction, we just don't know.